Greetings, good people! In our previous video we talked about the ketogenic diet and how it is the natural nutrition of man. But if things are thus, wouldn't it be true that it must have necessarily produced the greatest warriors in history? Today we will examine if it is like that. Who are those warriors and how did nutrition affect them? Case Study 1. The Scots. Scotland has always been a land much poorer than its traditional rival England, and despite that extreme financial and technological imbalance, was able to fight through the centuries on relatively equal terms with England. You see, Scottish warriors, especially the Highlanders, were always renowned for their superhuman strength, physicality, and endurance. Could this have anything to do with nutrition in the Highlands? Indeed, the Scottish Highlands were very poor as farmlands, as are all mountainous areas. The simple reason is that mountains are typically rocky, and only in small valleys do nutrients wash off and collect, which creates some few opportunities for relatively efficient farming. What's more, mountains create a lot of shadowy areas, which don't let the sun shine beneficially on crops. And also the temperatures on mountains are much lower than in the lowlands, so that the growing season is very small. So what are mountain people, such as the Scottish Highlanders, forced to do? They are forced to turn to grazing livestock, since grass grows everywhere, and in such areas as mentioned before, it is often, indeed, the only thing that grows. This creates a nutrition of almost exclusively meat and dairy, with the occasional addition of cold-hardy vegetables, such as cabbage and kale, which are the picture-perfect definition of a ketogenic diet. Of course, they also drank ale or whiskey, when they could have it, but that was their decadent luxury, and it is quite a mistake to think that it was always available to them. And if your body is accustomed to constantly being in ketosis, which is its natural state, it's fast and easy for it to return to it after a couple of drinks, if that is your only source of carbohydrates. Case Study 2. The Vikings. The Vikings, or in other words, the Viking Age Scandinavians, were some of the most iconic warriors in history, fascinating people all around the world with their superhuman exploits, made possible only by a ketogenic diet. What is interesting is that it seems, through reading the sagas, that even though Vikings from all Scandinavia were tough warriors, the toughest of Viking warriors seem to have been the Norwegian ones, which checks out with the fact that theirs was the most mountainous land, especially in western Norway, since, as we established before, mountainous lands create tough warriors, in big part due to a natural nutrition of almost exclusively meat and dairy. One can only imagine the level of physicality required to be able to navigate the cold northern seas for days, and then have the strength to fight successfully against the fresh, armed local warriors, and return back home with the loot. This level of endurance and sustained strength is something that can be accomplished by someone who's in ketosis and runs on his fat reserves instead of the very perishable carbohydrates. Even the food they were taking with them in campaigns was preserved meat and fish, salted or smoked. Case Study 3. The Spartans. Here we have another warrior culture which is legendary for its exploits, which also seems superhuman. The land around Sparta was poor and infertile, which seems to be a common pattern when it comes to creating a strong warrior culture. Still, the Spartans managed to create warriors so much stronger than any other city-state of ancient Greece that even rich and powerful Athens was finally defeated by the much smaller and poorer armies of those superhumans. And what did the Spartan soldier eat? The black stew. Here we see maybe the first example so far in our list of an army whose nutrition was not so much defined only by what was available, but also cultural design. Indeed, the lawmakers of Sparta decided that this is what the Spartan warrior should eat, I believe for two reasons. One, hunted boar was an available food source in almost every campaign, so it's a good idea to base the regular nutrition of their soldiers on it, so that between training and war nothing changes. And two, they had surely realized that a nutrition based on boar created incredible health benefits. Note that this is not the same as eating pork today, because today's pig is raised on a diet of corn and soy, and the pig is what it eats. So unless we're talking about pasture-raised pigs without soy as their protein source, those wild boars were a lot richer in vitamins and minerals than today's pork, so that they could, indeed, sustain a super soldier's nutritional needs. The Athenians were very fond of constantly mocking Spartan food as being terrible for their taste, while the Spartans were scorning Athenians for being decadent with their large carbohydrate-rich meals. Well, it was something that always made me wonder, way before I discovered the ketogenic diet. How can it be possible that Athenians, eating such a varied and rich diet, were not healthier and stronger than Spartans who were eating the same thing every single day? Well, history has proven quite decisively who was doing the right thing. I guess sometimes less is more. Case Study 4. The Mongols. The Mongolic armies swept across the earth under the rule of Temujin, commonly known as Genghis Khan, to create the most vast empire the world had ever seen. How was this possible, though? And what was their secret which created such an imbalance of power between them and all other kingdoms? Well, strategic and tactical brilliance aside, their organizational model was genius and allowed for tireless warriors that moved in impossible speeds for any distance, and that created such unfair advantage that allowed them to defeat any armies they met with relative ease. Their model was simple. They had a vast flock of sheep following the main army. The steppe did not have much in terms of nutrition, but one thing it had was endless grass, which could support sheep, amazing machines that can turn useless grass into very useful meat and dairy products. When their comrades would die, and they could spare their horses, they would slaughter them. Each horse provided a large amount of meat. They even had an emergency feeding method, by which they would stab the haunch of a horse and drink the blood. The wound would heal, and the area of injury was not very dangerous for the animal, which would replenish the blood in a short amount of time via grazing. As anthropology professor Jack Weatherford writes in his book Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, compared to the Jurched soldiers, the Mongols were much healthier and stronger. The Mongols consumed a steady diet of meat, milk, yogurt, and other dairy products, and they fought men who lived on gruel made from various grains. The grain diet of the peasant soldier stunted their bones, rotted their teeth, and left them weak and prone to disease. In contrast, the poorest Mongol soldier ate mostly protein, thereby giving him strong teeth and bones. Unlike the Jurched soldiers, who were dependent on a heavy carbohydrate diet, the Mongols could more easily go a day or two without food. What is especially interesting here is that the Jurched were also a Mongolic people, but which had settled and had turned to agriculture for its nutritional source. The same differences can be seen also in other cases, such as the Mongolic Turks, who were carrying preserved meat, the predecessor of pasturma, under their saddles as a food source, fighting the Byzantine armies, which were vastly superior in equipment and, one could argue, also in training. The difference in nutrition seems to have played an obvious role there as well, especially when it came to endurance during prolonged battles. Case Study 5. The Swiss. Switzerland is mountains, plain and simple. It doesn't get more mountainous in Europe than in the Swiss Alps. This means very limited options for nutrition, since not only is it mountainous, it also has a very high altitude in most parts of the country, severely limiting the options for realistic agriculture, especially with the tools of the past. This landscape, combined with the mostly Germanic people who reside on it, and their methodical approach to pretty much anything they decide to work on, created two things. One, a number of specialized animal breeds suited to the area, from goats to cattle for the production of meat and dairy, to chickens for the production of eggs and poultry meat. And two, the most superhuman mercenaries in European history. The Swiss mercenaries were using pikes in formation on the mountains, a feat which was considered impossible as pike formations work a lot better on flat terrain. And not just using them, but literally running and charging in formation, even setting traps and ambushes, such as rolling boulders down a slope and then charging down in perfect formation, turning and moving in perfect unison. Their endurance was also legendary, as they could run on the mountains for days to reach their destination or intercept an army. The Swiss mercenaries were so sought after that the rulers were often getting into bidding contests about who will hire them. History proves that they were worth it, because they almost always decided which the winning side was. Pretty interesting accomplishments for the people of a land with no carbohydrates, don't you think? But don't tell that to our modern-day strongmen and athletes, because it might blow their minds. Of course, I'm pretty sure there will be some people who will show up in the comments and say, yes, but they were also eating grains from here and there or something like that. Sure, if you squint your eyes too hard and try to believe that, it may actually become true in your mind. But if you think, honest to yourself, if it was not theoretically possible but realistically possible, that grains or even alcohol was something more than a very rare and occasional consumable, you will easily know the answer of why those men performed like that. What other examples of ketogenic warriors can you think of from history? Let us know in the comments below.